Hello BookTube, my name is Carrie and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing my mid-month wrap-up for October. So far I have read or listened to 9 books and I also have 1 DNF. So a lot to get through today and let's get started. So to start off October, I listened to the audiobook of With the Fire on High by Elizabeht Acevedo. This was narrated by the author and is the story of a young woman named Imani who is about to graduate high school, but she is really at a crossroads between responsibility and dreams. The responsibility being that she has a 2-year-old daughter who she is in this kind of awkward custodial situation with the father where they are trying to figure out visitation, and her grandmother is having to take on more responsibility but is simultaneously trying to pull back on some responsibility because Imani is an adult at this point. And then also with her dreams, because she dreams of becoming a chef, but she's not sure if she wants practical restaurant experience or a culinary arts program. And so we follow her through her senior year of high school as she is navigating a culinary arts class and all of these responsibilities outside of class and trying to come to terms with what she needs to do and what she wants to do. I really enjoyed this. I thought that Imani was such a likable character. She definitely has her flaws at moments, but also you really understand her frustration and really realistic of those situations, and I felt like she just really was one that you could so easily care for and become emotionally attached to. I think that she also really did grow throughout this story, and when I got to the ending of this book I was so emotional about it because of just how things were just really coming together for her and how this big journey that this story had taken us on. It was just so well done. I really love Elizabeht Acevedo's works. This is my second of hers and I am really excited to read Clap When You Land next. So yeah, I ended up giving this one a 4 out of 5 stars. Next I read 20 Love Poems and a Song of Despair by Pablo Neruda, translated from the Spanish by W.S. Merwin and introduced by Cristina García. I don't know how I picked this up. I just had a random copy on my e-reader and was like, oh, I've never heard of Pablo Neruda. I didn't even remember ever buying this collection, so I was like, I should definitely read it just to see what it's about. And I was really blown away by this. These were some really great love poems and I found that there was such a rawness to this. It was not even necessarily stories of lost love, although those are definitely a part of that, but it's just about the little things in relationships and just moments that I feel like everyone can relate to, whether that be romantic relationships or friendships. It was just a really nice collection and I am really happy with this. I hope that I can, obviously pick up more Pablo Neruda after this. He's a Chilean poet and yeah, this was just a pleasant surprise for the month and one that I'm really glad that I picked up. Then I listened to the audiobook of Disfigured on Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Spaces by Amanda Leduc. I believe I said in my TBR video it was Amanda Leduc or Leduc, and I found out with the audiobook that it is Amanda Leduc, so correction to that. And this was narrated by Amanda Barker. I have a lot of issues with this book, but the biggest one being that it's just not advertised as what it's about. It's advertised as a history of disfigurement in fairy tales and how that has shaped problematic ideals of disfigurement and disability in general. And that is what I found interesting about this book. It is included in the book in a part, but the majority of this book is a memoir of Amanda Leduc's own struggle with her disabilities. And I do find it an important subject matter, but I think that it would have been better executed if it had been a separate work from this, because I didn't really understand how the fairy tales were tying into her own story of this. It just felt very I want to write about fairy tales and the history of disfigurement in those, but I also want to tie in my own life experience, and that just was not well connected. There is also an issue with the scope of this because she was trying to examine not only the Grimm's fairy tales but Disney and even Marvel superheroes, and it was just always expanding but never coming back together. There was no overarching narrative to this that was cohesive. It was just all over the place, and this made the parts that were about her actual struggles with her disability difficult to really understand in the thread of all of this, because I was 1 minute listening to the story of a Grimm's fairy tale, and then the next was her saying, oh well, I was in the worst depression of my life at this point, and I was like, wait, because of the fairy tale. Like, I didn't understand where the threads were coming from this. On top of all of this, there were a lot of issues with the Grimm section. I just, as someone who studied German literature in college, and like German literature, especially Grimm's fairy tales, were the majority of my research, this was a little frustrating for me because a lot of the examinations of the Grimm's fairy tales were very surface level, and I felt like also there is a big issue with this where if you are going to include the German names in this, you need to make sure that you are getting correct translations of that, and also that you have an audio narrator who is pronouncing it in the correct German, both of which did not happen. There was one translation that the author had that was just completely incorrect, and no proof of translation was like ever acknowledged in this. There was no list of who she was getting these translations from. And furthermore, the narrator of this was god-awful in terms of German pronunciation in general. She pronounced the word for fairy tales wrong. She pronounced the names of the Grimm brothers incorrectly. And that would have been fine if she had stuck to the English, like, pronunciation, but she didn't. She switched between the German and the English in mid, like, discussion of it. And it was just so frustrating. I understand that this is a like more of an issue for me than like every like general reader, because like obviously I have a little bit more of a like personal connection to that, but there were just a lot of issues with that section that I don't think are fair to her argument in this. I just don't feel like it was right that it was made like this. So yeah, that was just a lot. There's also a seriously popular TV show in this that she just completely spoils the ending of for no reason. She's speculating that the character has a mental illness, but that is not how it's set up in the show. It was just completely unnecessary and just her like wanting to talk about this, and that's again not what this book was about. It was just overall so irritating because nothing was coming together in this. This was a work that I appreciate for what it is, that it is the author's like own narration of her struggles with disability. Those were interesting and I did understand and, you know, become like emotional with those. But my issue was that she was trying to tie it together to too many things and trying to do way too much with this work. And quite frankly, they were things that she wasn't making accurate connections to or even like a good argument with, in my opinion. And yeah, I just think that this book was not at all what I had thought it would be, and that was really my biggest issue with this. That was a long rant there, but I ended up giving this book 1 out of 5 stars. On a happier note, I then listened to The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman, and this was narrated by the author, and it was absolutely excellent. I remember in like middle school, we read the first few chapters of this, and for some reason didn't finish it, and so this is one that has been on my like to be finished shelf for a while now. This is the story of Nobody Owens, who at the beginning of the novel, we find out that his parents have been killed, as has his younger sister, and someone is trying to kill him. But because he accidentally wanders into this graveyard, he is protected by the spirits in there from this killer who wants to completely murder his entire family. And we follow him as he grows up from there. This was such a cute story. It definitely is like horror genre in most regards, but there was just such a sentimentality to this, and like the friendships he creates and the atmosphere of the graveyard, and how he becomes like such an integral part of the graveyard and of these like spirits that surround him, because also the ghosts of the graveyard are all characters in this story as well. And it was just, oh yeah, it was such a good cozy like start to the spooky season read, and I absolutely loved it. I ended up giving it a 4 to 5 stars. Then I finally made my way to Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. This was a carryover from my September TBR, and I finally finished it. Oh, and I don't know if you can tell from these tabs, but I loved this. This starts out as the story of 2 sisters who, well, 2 half-sisters actually, who are born into separate villages in Ghana, completely unaware of one another, and we then follow 8 descendants after that. And I was just blown away by how well this novel worked, considering that it is more of like short stories almost, because each chapter is a new character and we follow a new like storyline with that character. It did still tie together so well, and I felt like there were issues at times with not being able to you know, emotionally connect to some characters more than others, but overall, every story in this did feel essential. And it felt essential to understanding this family's history, and especially as we work our way more and more towards the present day, we can see the threads of these families and their lives, and how these little things that a lot of people take for granted, and when they do know their family history, is just like so heartbreaking, because some of these family members will never be able to know the history of their family beyond a certain point. There are a lot of like serious movements that are touched on in this. Like obviously there's themes of slavery, colonization, but also even in terms of like, especially on the American side of this, when we follow like the family that ends up in the United States, we follow them through, you know, slavery, the Civil War, and then the Jim Crow era, and then the Harlem Renaissance, and then the Civil Rights era, and then even more so into you know, like the crack cocaine epidemic and things like that. And it's so interesting because those are like such pivotal moments in the Black experience in America, but it is a lot to like try and include in one book. But I think the way that Yaa Gyasi did it was so well done, and it didn't feel inauthentic. It felt like real stories from real people's lives, and I just have such a love for this book. I definitely think that I will reread this in the future. I think specifically there are certain sections that I will definitely go back to over the years. There's one character in particular, I think it was Yaa, who his story really, like, that is where I have like the most of my like highlights in, because I related a lot to a lot of his views on things that he expressed in that section, and a lot of his like wonders and questioning of his life, and I just really loved this, and I'm so happy but so like sad that I waited so long to get to it. But Yaa Gyasi will definitely be an author that I read from again, and I just love this book. The next book was one that after 3 attempts over 3 years, I finally finished, and that is Dracula by Bram Stoker. I did not actually read this physical edition, which is from Arcturus Classics, which these are the classics that I actually collect back here, and then I have some nonfiction ones like over that way. But I love these editions. They're just really pretty, and I definitely don't want to like break the spines on them. So I ended up listening to the audiobook of this, which is narrated by Tim Curry, Alan Cummings, and then it has like a more like in-depth full cast narration, which I'll list obviously below, but I can't remember like the other narrators, which is kind of bad. But I just cannot believe that I'm finally through with this book, because I'm gonna be honest, if I hadn't had the like physical book on my shelves, I would have DNF'd the audiobook. I just have a lot of issues with this book, mainly the fact that it is considered this like cult classic, I think has really taken away from what this book is, because knowing the story of Dracula, like knowing what Dracula is, just really defeats the entire purpose of this book. Because so it's definitely a classic that has suffered from its influence of like how widely it has influenced pop culture, and that's really unfortunate, because this is a book that is meant to like be one of the original horror novels. It's meant to build this like anticipation and tension, and it just doesn't really do that, because we all know what Dracula is. So I just felt like it fell a little flat for me in terms of, I was like, why are we building to this? Like, I already know what is happening. So that was a little sad. I felt like it was an enjoyable read, but the writing was very repetitive in this, and the pacing was just really slow for me. I felt like the beginning of the novel especially was just dragging out so much, and that was where it was also most repetitive, because every day was like the same thing. I think that the repetitiveness was in some sense meant to build tension or like foreshadow certain events, but again, that just didn't really work with this, because we all know the story of Dracula in its most basic terms. Also, just really couldn't get over the misogyny in Bram Stoker's writing, especially with the only female character who he didn't kill off, which was, I feel like I shouldn't say the character name now, but spoiler, he didn't kill off Mina, and it's almost worse that he didn't, because she was like constantly relegated as like a second-class citizen to all the men that surrounded her. If she did something that was considered brave, a character would say, oh, she was brave like a man. Or they would say, oh, she can't go along with us for this. She's too delicate of a creature. And like, it was just so irritating, especially when she would like give forth an idea. The characters would be absolutely astounded by the thought that she could think, and like a male character would then like basically rephrase the same idea and they would be like, excellent, bravo. No, just no. And you know, I understand with classics we have to really take them for what they were at the time, and this was definitely a product of its time, but it was misogynistic then still. We just didn't call it that, and it's still misogynistic today. Overall, I'm glad to have pushed myself through it. Like, I finished it at least, but yeah, I ended up giving it a 2 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to the audiobook of Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn. This is the story of a 30-something-year-old woman named Camille Preaker, who she is a journalist who has actually just recently gotten out of a psychiatric hospital due to self-harming and also like some mild alcoholism. And she ends up having to be sent back to her hometown where she grew up because there have been a series of murders of little girls, and her newspaper basically wants the inside scoop on the story, and since she's from there, she's obviously the best journalist to send there. And this is a really big conflict for Camille because she has a lot of very traumatic memories from her small town, especially considering her years growing up there and the loss of her sister and her very strained relationship with her mother. This is a story of her trying to come to terms with her childhood in this small town and like face a lot of those traumas, but also of her trying to figure out what happened to these little girls who went missing. This was actually adapted into a television series by HBO back a couple years ago with Amy Adams, who I absolutely love, and I actually watched that series before reading this, and that is what made me want to pick this up. And I'm so glad that it did because I really loved this. I have never really read a thriller before this one, and I could not get enough of this story. I thought that it was so well done. Even though I knew the story from like the show, there were still like some slight differences that I really appreciated in this, and I felt like I was still like anxious about like, oh, what's gonna happen next, like what's gonna happen here. And yeah, it was just really interesting. I really loved Camille as a character. I felt like a lot of her struggles and her flaws were just so understandable. Definitely a very morally gray character, and I really appreciate that in this because it felt more realistic to the story, because in a situation like this there's not going to be this perfect character, and that is actually kind of a concept played with her mother in this, where her mother sees herself as this perfect, like morally just woman, and Camille like can't really understand how her mother refuses to acknowledge she has flaws. And I really love that aspect to this story. It was a great examination of a family in this as well. And yeah, I was really surprised to also find out by this that this was Gillian Flynn's actual like first novel, I believe. So I definitely think I'm gonna work my way up like through her other works. And oh, the narrator, Anne-Marie Lee, she was absolutely amazing in this. I honestly forgot sometimes that this wasn't like Amy Adams narrating this, because she sounds very close to like Amy Adams' voice in the series, so that was like a nice touch to this. But she had an excellent narration style. You could even tell when there were like character differences, like the different voices she used were excellent. Yeah, I was just really blown away by this one. I ended up giving it a 5 out of 5 stars. Then I listened to the audiobook of Furia by Yamile Saied Méndez, and this was the second young adult pick for Reese Witherspoon's young adult book club that she runs on Instagram. And I was so excited for this because this is the story of a young girl named Camila Hassan, who is growing up in Argentina, and she is obsessed with soccer. She wants to become a professional soccer player, but this is really taboo in her country because female like soccer players are really prejudiced against. There like are some horrible like stereotypes that are thrown upon them, and they're actively discouraged from participating in the sport. And so Camila is trying to really like navigate her way of like hiding this secret, but also like finding a job and dealing with her family that has a very strained dynamic, especially between her parents, where her mother is loving and supportive, but is a little bit like submissive to their father in terms of like he sets all rules, even though they can be very harsh. He is very critical of her mother and of her and her brother as well. Her brother is also navigating his way into professional soccer. It's just a really interesting dynamic that she's trying to navigate in this. And adding on to that is also that this boy who she'd had a crush on forever and shared this one kiss with, named Diego, he ended up going away to Italy to become a professional soccer star and has come back and is slowly trying to work his way back into the good graces of Camila. So there's a lot going on in this novel, and I will say that that remains throughout. There are a lot of issues discussed in this, especially issues that are currently like facing Argentina, and the majority of those being women's issues, and circulating around like the disappearance of young women in the country, women's rights, especially women's reproductive rights, and also the like gender expectations and gender roles of women in society. And I just was blown away because Camila herself has all of these like tensions with her family and her passions and her responsibilities, but then also there's this extra layer of all of these like social political issues that are like circulating around her and at times like interweaving with her life. And it was just so well done. It didn't feel heavy-handed. It didn't feel like she was trying to force a narrative or force a like political or like social commentary onto the reader. It genuinely felt like an authentic story, and I think that that was just an excellent takeaway from this. I also really loved how much Camila loved soccer. As a really big soccer fan myself, it was just so amazing to hear her talk about the sport and talk about especially women's soccer and how underappreciated that is at times, and her own passion for the sport. I ended up actually listening to the author's note in the audiobook. The audiobook was actually narrated by Sol Madariaga, I believe, and I ended up listening to the author's note at the end of this because once the story ended, I was just like all giddy, and I was like, oh, I actually do want to hear like more about the author, to like know about other works that she's done. And it was a really personal author's note, talking about her own struggles with you know, like a lot of the things that are currently going on in Argentina, and her wish to really make an own voices book about those issues, but also how this book wasn't really autobiographical, but she definitely shared a lot of the experiences of Camila, and especially her love of soccer. And it was just so touching, and I was just like really giddy at the end of this book. I really loved it, and I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I have the only DNF so far this month, and that is Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Sadavi. This is translated from the Arabic by Jonathan Wright. I was really disappointed by this because this is the one that I was really looking forward to the most this month. I have had this on my TBR for a number of years now, and it is a kind of reimagining of Frankenstein set in US occupied Baghdad, following this man named Hadi, who is basically constructing this corpse as a like political statement because the Iraqi government won't like bury just like single body parts or like return certain body parts to family members. So people that are killed in these like bombings and things like that, their bodies are just like left to rot on the street basically, or like thrown away in the garbage, which is obviously a very disrespectful and not like a proper burial for these people or closure for the families. And I will say that's what it's advertised as. That's not exactly what this story is. It's more of an examination of the people living in this city and how they are kind of coping with this occupation, and how the war like impacts their lives, but also is definitely at a distance in some senses. How there are long-lasting effects of multiple wars that have happened in Iraq. And I found that interesting, but I didn't really enjoy the like inclusion of the Frankenstein retelling in this. I found it to be not as well executed as I thought it would be, and this story really jumps around a lot. So that's saying something in the sense of like, I didn't appreciate that storyline because that was such a small part of this, and that was like the most important theme of this story, but it just didn't feel well connected to the other things. It also like, Hadi is not a likable character really. He also is not really making this as like a political statement. He's making it more for like his own reasons, and that was just like a really awkward like delineation from what this book is like described as being, because that kind of changes the context of this a little bit. I again really enjoyed the individual stories. I think this would have worked better without this like supernatural element, but that unfortunately wasn't what this was, and I just felt like it didn't connect that well together. I gave it up to the halfway point, and then I was like, I really cannot read more of this because I was not invested in the story. I found that whenever I put this down, I had no desire to pick it back up. I just did not enjoy it. Really disappointed. Next, I listened to the audiobook of Turn of the Screw by Henry James. This was narrated by Emma Thompson and Richard Armitage, and I do think I am still gonna read Daisy Miller from this collection because this is like a bind up. I love this cover. It's one of the like Penguin like paperback classics. I listened to the audiobook of this just because I've heard that it was definitely more atmospheric, and I found out that this was actually a like inspiration for the TV show The Haunting of Bly Manor, and I actually just watched The Haunting of Hill House earlier this month, and I was like, oh my god, it's by the same people, I have to watch that. But I wanted to read The Turn of the Screw first to see like what the influence would be, and this was a total letdown. I really do not understand the hype around this. I was so confused in this. Characters received like no development, and also like there's just no concept of time in this. Like there is like one page was like talking about, well, not one page, but like one chapter is like talking about like the like governess is just like moving in and she is like just getting acquainted with these people, and then like there's like one conversation with another character, and then all of a sudden she is like in another conversation and she's like, it was months ago that this happened, and I'm like, wait, what? Like what? How was it months ago? It didn't make any sense. I was just like really confused by this. It also just didn't really build up a lot of like tension or anticipation, so that was like a little problematic because this is like supposed to be a like ghost story, so it's supposed to build that up. And since there was so little development, it was just not there. It also felt really unfinished in the sense of like, this felt like an outline of a story. There was no real like depth to it or no real forethought into how to like tie it all together. Especially considering the ending in this, I just feel like this was unfinished or something because it just doesn't make sense to me. Like, I do not understand the hype around this. I gave it a 2 stars. And I'm really, like, the more that I'm thinking on it, I'm just like, this is a 1-star read. It was not enjoyable. Now, those are all the books that I have read so far this month, but I am still, like, currently reading some books. The first of which is Classic Tales of Horror by Edgar Allan Poe. This is one of the Arcturus editions as well. And this is just a collection of, I think, 20 or 21 of Poe's short stories. I used to really love Poe whenever I was in like middle school and high school. I loved his work, and so this is kind of a more deeper delve into some of the stories that I've missed over the years, but this also has some of my favorites in it. I have been kind of let down by this so far because the first couple that I've read were just kind of meh. I am only on page 49, and I think I'm supposed to be on page like 84 or something like that. So I need to kind of catch up with this one. Because there are some of my like favorites coming up and some stories that I've heard like just better of in general. So hopefully I won't like totally hate this one by the end of the month. Oh, also I have a little like bookmark that is from a bookstore from where I went to university at, and it's the Raven, and it's just like so cute. Oh yeah, sorry, that just like makes my heart happy because it's like Edgar Allan Poe, the Raven. And then I also am behind on my Buddy Read book club with my friend from college. I still have not finished our selection for the first half of the month, and that is The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. I read the first like 20 or 30 pages and I really enjoyed it. Actually, I really enjoy Toni Morrison's writing style in this, but I just didn't have time to read it, and so now I am gonna try to get through it today while I have some extra time. I think that this will be one that'll be really easy to finish once I like get in the motion of it. But yeah, so behind on this, which means that I'm also going to be behind on Giovanni's Room, but I think that I will still like definitely be able to finish those through the month. And then most noticeable is that I am behind on Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. And this one is more for like superficial reasons. I still haven't decided if I want to read this like physical copy because I'm a little worried about breaking the spine because it's not like a floppy book. It's definitely like a harder book. So I may actually pick this one up on audio, but we will see because I have a couple more books that I'd like to listen to on audio before this month is over. So we're gonna have to see how this one falls. So those are the ones that I'm like really behind on right now. But overall, I have done pretty well with my TBR. Outside of those books, I have 4 more that I'd like to get to this month, but one of those is definitely going to be on audiobook. Yeah, but that's where I'm at with that. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and that you guys are having a better reading month than I am in October, and yeah, happy reading. Bye!